I can't get no call to action, but I try, and I try, and I try, and I try.
Hello and welcome to Call to Action, the go-to podcast for anyone trying to make sense of the world of marketing and advertising. In an industry that is a minefield of utter bollocks, we aim to capture our heroes and allies from the front line to have a chin-wag with. It's like Pokemon Go, with the single but vital exception that it's not a short-term bandwagon of shite. It's brought to you by Gasp, and I'm Giles Edwards, co-founder and MD. Today, I've caught Glenn Fisher. Arguably the most famous person to be born in Grimsby by default, Glenn became a copywriter after a number of years working in the local council. For over a decade, he worked with Agora, a multi-million-pound international financial publisher, as head of copy. He is now freelance, focusing on coaching aspiring copywriters, and has recently published his first book, The Art of the Click, which explores direct response copywriting. It's received glowing endorsements from some of the best, including previous Call to Action guests Richard Shotton and Vikki, who describes it as an effortless but brilliant one-to-one masterclass. Welcome to the show, Glenn.
Hello, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be on. I'm just thinking Kevin Clifton's not going to be happy saying I'm the most famous person from Grimsby. Probably Tommy Turgoose as well, but the famous copywriter.
Okay, we'll go with famous copywriter. It's a good title to have, regardless of where you're born. So, quick fire questions. Coffee or tea?
Tea, Earl Grey.
Mac or PC?
Mac these days.
Book or Facebook?
Book, 100%.
Notepad or iPad?
Ooh, iPad, although I should say notebook, it's cooler.
Be honest.
Yeah, no, iPad.
Jonathan Ross or Vikki Ross?
Oh, Vikki Ross, all day long.
Korma or Vindaloo?
Vindaloo, absolutely.
P.G. Wodehouse or Ernest Hemingway?
Ooh, do you know what? I'm going to go for P.G. Wodehouse.
Why is that?
I'm going to go for P.G. Wodehouse because I think if I was stuck on a kind of desert island situation, I think I'd probably want more laughs than thinking too much. So I'd go for P.G. Wodehouse on that account.
That's good logic.
But that's a tough one.
That's why we left it to last. So how did it all start for you, Glenn? So we like to ask all our guests to talk us through their first ever job and then the first job which was relevant to what they do now. So do you remember your first job and how that led into copywriting?
Well, I remember my very first job was delivering the local newspaper, which used to get dropped off at my house, and I cried the first time I ever saw like 500 copies of this paper and I had to hand them out. But that's kind of childhood jobs. My first proper job was in finance. I was an auditor for the local council, and prior to my copywriting career, I wanted to be a kind of bank manager. I wanted to be an accountant of some description. I don't know what was quite wrong with me, but that was my ambition, and I was pursuing that and managed using nepotism. My mum's always worked in the local council, was able to get a job and became an auditor. Was training to be an accountant, doing the AT&T or whatever the accounting qualifications were, was kind of going into local council offices, into various departments, into local schools, analysing their finances, looking at the financial controls and systems they had in place, writing reports about them and making recommendations. Bear in mind, this was like a 22-year-old kid. I was just out of sixth form college. I don't know if you even say sixth form college anymore. I don't know if that's a thing, but whatever A-level period study is, I did that. I didn't go to university originally, and was doing that, and that was my job. How that has any relation to copywriting, we still don't quite know. It did help that when I kind of landed in the financial copywriting niche, that knowledge was helpful. But yeah, I was doing that for probably, I don't know, the maths don't really work out, and I don't understand how old I am, how long I spent in various periods. At the same time as doing that job, I wasn't completely just a square geeky accountant person. I was in the nighttime. I was cool alternative punk rocker and was playing music and traveling the country playing with different bands. So that kind of time blurs a bit. But I was doing that, and something in my mind clicked or blew up or broke. A tripwire got hit, and I figured I didn't want to do that anymore. And I'm still to this day trying to figure out what happened. But yeah, it kind of fizzled out, my interest in that. I realized I didn't want to spend the rest of my life doing that. And I realized that I liked writing. And it was a pure kind of by chance discovery, really. I was never a big writer at school or anything like that. All my friends were a lot more academic and read a lot more. I read classics when I was a kid, but not particularly a bookwormy teenager or anything. But around the age of, I think it was about 22-ish, I discovered the world of literature and writing, and that coincided with me deciding I didn't want to do this job anymore. So I quit and went to study writing. I went to do a mature student degree, what have you, at a local college. And from there, I said, right, I need to get a job as a writer, or at least using words in some way. And that's how I led to copy. But yeah, so that was my first job, really, the proper one.
What was your course like? So the objective of the course was to train you to be a writer, which I think...
It was quite interesting, really, because I didn't... So it was... where I'm from Grimsby and Cleethorpes, which is on the east coast of England. It's a kind of end of the line. No one comes here unless they need to kind of place. And it was, even at that point, the colleges here, the Grimsby Institute has kind of got a bit bigger in the past few years since I left. And now there are more students doing stuff, but at the time it was a very vocational place. If you was doing a course, you needed to have, it wasn't creative writing, it was billed as professional writing, and it was the aim that you would get a job afterwards, kind of thing. And what the course was really, you learnt a bit of how to write novels, how to write scripts, how to write non-fiction, how to write theatre. It had every genre kind of covered, and then you kind of picked whatever you wanted to do. At the time, I wanted to be a novelist. I wanted to follow in the footsteps of P.G. Wodehouse and Ernest Hemingway and write fiction. That was what I was doing. I'd started writing kind of weird, funny short stories, quite surreal things, and I'd done a 2-hour night class just to kind of see if I could do it. And the tutor of that said I had a kind of skill or what have you, and that I should do something with it. So doing that degree was kind of just to kind of figure out what I was doing. I didn't really understand how I was constructing sentences or paragraphs or tone of voice or anything like that. So that's why I did that. But there was no, even at that point, there was nothing, no one said you can go and be a copywriter. I had no idea what copywriting was. I had no concept of the fact that someone wrote sales messages. That sounds weird, but I think half the world still thinks that. People very rarely ask who writes this stuff. It's just there. It's like this kind of unseen thing. You don't put two and two together. So at the time, I had no idea what copywriting was. I did this course. My final major project was to write a novel, which I wrote this novel, which was okay. It got me a first and all that nonsense, but I read it now and it's disgusting, and like the sentences, and it's like the most unclear thing in the world. It's amazing. But I did all that, and that was nice. And then I needed to get a job writing, so I just applied for any job that had the word writer in it, junior writer or what have you. And obviously, because I was in Grimsby, the only writing job you could really get around here at the time was for the local paper, which I didn't want to be a journalist. I knew very strongly I didn't want to be a reporter or anything like that. I wanted a creative aspect to the job. That's not to say like good investigative journalists aren't creative and everything. Of course they are, but I didn't want to just tell like the story, like every day repeat the story of how the docks aren't working so much and there's some people down this street have stabbed each other kind of thing. I didn't want to just report on things. I wanted to create something. So that meant going to London or Manchester I was looking at, and eventually, long story short, I saw this job application for a junior writer for Agora. I didn't at the time. The chap who employed me was a bit of a maverick, and the details of the job were very, very blurred, and I didn't really know what the company was. I didn't know who I was even applying to. I was trying to do research like a good boy, as Mum had taught me, to kind of find out about the company and who I was speaking to. Could not find any of that, and it later transpired that I'd found that the guy who interviewed me had like put a fake name and everything so that people didn't bother him and all this kind of stuff. But I went to the interview, and after writing a very strange little story about trying to sell a suit, and I went to that interview. I we talked for like an hour and a half or something. Mainly we joked, and I came out of the interview and I still had no idea what copywriting was. I certainly didn't understand what direct response marketing was, or long copy, or anything like that. But the guy was really funny. We hit it off, and it just seemed exciting and interesting. So I was lucky enough to get the job, and packed my bags like Dick Whittington and moved to London, and started with what turned out to be Agora. Little did I know it was an international billion-dollar company with offices all over the world. We're kind of masters at this weird long copy stuff, and I basically sat down in an office surrounded by people, and there's all these long copy sales letters everywhere, and I was kind of like, no one reads this. Like, what are you talking about? This can't make money. Little did I know it's a very successful and very effective way to do marketing.
And is that what you typically would be working on most days, is long copy sales?
Yeah, so I was very lucky that the chap who employed me was a very, shall we say, modern, as a euphemism. He was just a very relaxed bloke, and he basically said, look, there's two writing routes in this company. You can either be an editor who kind of comes up with the ideas of what to write about, or you can be a copywriter who takes those ideas and finds a way to put them into a sales message. And I kind of just did a bit of both for a while, which meant that I was learning how to write editorial, how to engage with readers on an ongoing basis, but also I was learning about copywriting and learning how to craft those ideas into more salesy messages, and ultimately elicit direct responses from people to buy those. So for many years, I kind of just skirted both sides of that. I'd write a daily email about like what you now call a blog. It was like 500, 800 words. So I'd be writing every day, communicating directly with the readership. And then I'd also be working on these long copy sales letters, which is where the kind of big major skill of learning to write copy came from. And there's decades of learning. And I was very lucky that at the time, Bill Bonner, who owns Agora, and his main partner, Mark Ford, were both in England to teach the writers in the room at that point. So I was lucky to be one of them. So kind of worked with the founders of this company, and they've spent decades analyzing direct response copy in all forms, from Ogilvy stuff to kind of the niche stuff that no one's ever heard of. And I just kind of sat there. It was fantastic. I was just ready to absorb as much as I could. Learn about how to construct these long sales letters, which people still to this day like mostly look at you gone out when you start talking about them. But I have since realized that everything I learned over that period is pretty much everything you need to know about how to persuade people to act.
And you mentioned direct, so writing direct response. Can you explain what direct response is?
Sure. So you basically you can look at. I mean, there's two main forms of advertising. There's direct response. There's indirect response. Indirect response is your Mad Men kind of stuff. It's your branding. It's your Coke advert on the tube, where you see the sexy guy drinking his Diet Coke, and the hope is that you have an indirect response, that when you're in the supermarket, you'll think, oh, I saw that sexy man drinking his Coke. I'd like a sexy man right now. I'll buy a Coke. Direct response is where you open the magazine and there's a coupon at the bottom and it says, if you want this can of Coke, send this response to me now. Respond directly, give me the money, do the thing now. And that is direct response ultimately. So in my particular niche that I learned at that stage, it was a case of selling financial advice, financial newsletters, and you would argue for why someone should buy this particular newsletter, follow this particular expert's opinion, and then you would ask at the end specifically for the cash, for the credit card details, and you would try and elicit a direct response. It's not about branding. It's not about kind of putting it in the reader's mind and then hoping they'll pick again another day. It's you're looking to get a response there and then. And that obviously lends into the advantage of the copy being measurable. You can test different variables, and it's kind of do or die. You can see if it works. If no one responds to it, it doesn't work. There's no, oh, well, I like that, and I thought that was cool, and that was hip, and what have you, and everybody's talking about it on Twitter, and it's got an award and all this kind of stuff because it's really creative. It was simply, no, that doesn't work, try again kind of thing. So it was a good, quite a cold and hard kind of emotional roller coaster to go through when you spend all this time writing this thing and then it flops and you're like, oh God, what was the point in that? But when it works very well. And yeah, it was really interesting. I'm glad for myself. In hindsight, I came through that pathway. There is I always quote Ogilvy, who said he would only employ writers and stuff who had spent 2 years in direct response because they understood the measurability, the importance of the sale, and it wasn't just about being cool kind of thing.
Yeah, I think that's important. I think so much is lost down to subjectivity, but as you say, it really is binary. Does it work or doesn't it work? The language of subjectivity, of liking something, Dave Trott would describe that as the language of the reader, of the general public, not the professional who's actually behind it.
Sure. I mean, it warms my heart to see people like Dave Trott and others in the what I'd probably describe in a more indirect world. Really, they operate in quite a brand aware place, but they are insightful enough and clever enough to give that kudos to the facts of life that we need things to sell. That's the whole point. That's why we do what we do. And I do. There's a lot of people who talk a lot of guff on the internet, and I see it every day. But I'm glad there are big names like that who understand that it is the facts are important. It's not just about what's cool and what people like around the room.
And it shouldn't be about that at all, really, should it? What you say about Dave and perhaps being more focused on the brand stuff, but ultimately, whether it's short or long term, it all works or doesn't work. It's just not an immediate response, I suppose.
Yes, yeah, no, I think that's a good thing to remind actually as well, because I always say like even if you're a little tweet to me, like everything in my mind is direct response or should like be thought of in a framework of direct response, in the sense that if you're building a brand, even you're ultimately ending up in a direct response at some point. So it needs to have a reason to exist. If you're just doing it for fun, for a laugh, or because everybody else is doing it, or if you haven't got a strategy behind your particular marketing or copy, then it's not going to be effective anyway. Even a brand campaign should have, as much as possible, clear reasons to exist and clear performance indicators that you can at least put some form of measurement on it to see that it's working.
Yeah, I mean, I like to use a very simple metaphor of you're either watering the tree or you're picking the fruit. So I think your direct response stuff is clearly picking the fruit, but without the brand building stuff, it wouldn't be there to pick in the first place.
No, you're right.
So going from there to sharing your masterclass, as Vikki articulated, with the art of the click. So how did that happen, and why did you decide to give away so many secrets?
I like the idea that the thought that there might be secrets in there. I'm very liberal with ideas, and I think you should be. I think giving away how you do things and all that kind of thing, I've always been a fan of that. I can very early on working in Agora, just that whole mindset was always there. It was always being very open about things, because it's kind of that, there's probably some stock phrase of like the brilliance of abundance or something along those lines. But if you share more things and more people are successful, if you're all nice to each other and you do that, like, that's cool. You're gonna remember who gave you that tip, and you're gonna respect them and all that kind of stuff. So from a point of view of sharing secrets, I'll happily share how to do everything with anyone. I'll even give people ideas as often as I can, because ultimately you'll have to come back to me if you want more ideas. So that was always a mindset for me. It's funny, I was speaking about this with my partner recently, and talking, and like, I'm kind of looking at doing my next book now, and figuring that out. And we were talking about the first book, and the fact is, I always knew, even when I stopped kind of doing the fiction writing and kind of decided that I'd get a job rather than kind of going down a more academic route, I always knew I wanted to just write. And classically, I just wanted to do a book. Like, there's no kind of big secret around it. I just wanted to write a book eventually. It just so happened that over the years, writing about direct response copy, I just started accumulating a lot of stuff. I obviously got this knowledge and was able to kind of communicate that knowledge. So it just started kind of coming together, and I thought, well, actually, I think I might have enough for a book here. And then as I was doing that, a load of serendipitous things occurred. Like, I just somehow got talking to Harriman House. They were interested in doing a book, so we started talking about what that might look like. Had some back and forth with them. Had most of it in place, then just had to kind of move some stuff around and add some bits and bobs here. And it just kind of, I almost see that book as like my first decade in advertising. It's everything I learned from direct response. And I tried to boil it down into a fun, easy to read thing, and started to kind of find my style. And that's where we are. I've since learned that book kind of opened the door to me realizing that I can write how I want to write, and I can share information in the way I want to share information, which is, it sounds a bit weird, and I don't know if I'm making a very cogent point, but I've figured out that you don't need to like define yourself in fiction or non-fiction, or writing about advertising or not writing about advertising. I've just realized you can just, if you write interesting things, people respond to them. So that's how the book came about. I just realized I had enough information to produce the first book, but then I've realized since that I've got a lot more to share. So I'm quite excited about the new stuff that's coming.
How have you taken the response to the book? So before you answer that, just to add some context, David Ogilvy described Drayton Bird as someone who knows more about direct marketing than anyone in the world. Drayton Bird described your book, or responded to your book, by saying, "Don't write another word till you've read The Art of the Click."
I know, I had to pay a lot of money to Drayton for that. And I've got a picture of Drayton very drunk that I'm still holding captive from the world. If he doesn't say nice things about me continuously,
I wondered why he
then I
went for a few weeks.
will release it. Yeah. No, it's very nice. It's very kind. I've learned it's a funny old thing when you start getting a bit of publicity, and it's a strange game. People are equally kind and nasty, and it's a very weird world we live in. But it's been fantastic, and the feedback to the book has been absolutely amazing. And the biggest catch is I spend half my time trying to create genuine emotions and authenticity in sales messages and stuff. And I realize the biggest place I need to display how genuine I am is in the thanking people for the response to my book. But I always think I just sound like disingenuous. But anyone who's read the book, and anyone who's posted a positive review or emailed me, shared things on Twitter, it's just fantastic. You cannot beat the feeling of people reading what you've put down, what you've said, and saying, actually, I found that really useful, really helpful, it's inspired me, or what have you. And there's been some fantastic comments from people. It's ace. It really is genuinely ace. People like Drayton saying that very kind. I sent a copy to Drayton, and he had a read, and he didn't need to say that, but he did, and he wrote a very nice thing to his readers, which is obviously great. A lot of people respect Drayton, and he's a massive name in the business, so that was fantastic. But equally, people who have, I can remember one of the first reviews I got was from a chap who runs a little snooker website selling snooker equipment, and he'd literally taken what I'd written, got some ideas, improved the copy on his website, and made more sales of his stuff. And I was just like, how brilliant is that? Like, that is, it's just fantastic. So every level across the board has been fantastic to receive that information. It's just nice to produce something that people find worth something. I as I say, when I did my degree, I was kind of thinking about doing a master's and trying to write novels and all that kind of stuff. But something in my head clicked, and I thought, well, I love literature so much, and I feel like I haven't got enough experience to write something quite yet. And in my mind, that's kind of stopped me from going down that path. And I thought, well, I'll get a little bit more experience first. And I'm glad that after 10 years of writing copy, I've kind of produced this thing, and there is enough information in there. There is enough insight that people have found it useful. So that's been really nice.
And the book is sprinkled with superb tips, as I kind of alluded to earlier. Is there any in particular that you like to, or you can share with us on the pod?
Tips. I would always say read everything loud. That's one of my favorite tips, because no one does it. But if they did, it would help you improve your writing so much. I would say don't write a thing until you know what you're writing. Copywriting is a bit of a flawed word, because it puts so much focus on the actual writing of the thing, but it is an ideas game, and the majority of time you'll waste writing is because you don't quite know what to write. A message will be less clear. It will be more confusing if you don't know what you're trying to say. So I would encourage everyone to spend time thinking before they try writing. It's so often people rush and try and crack something out like it's the last thing that people think of in many cases. When I said, I know like agencies and that sit around tables and think about this, but small businesses, small to medium businesses who are or freelancers or people who are on their own and think, well, I'll do the copy myself, I can do that. There's nothing wrong with that, but they often just kind of write what's in their head straight away and don't give themselves time to think about it. So think about it first and then edit it massively afterwards as well. But other than that, there's loads of tips you could give, but I think one of my most popular ones from what people tell me is the purely technical act of making your in your Word document, making your margins 13 and your font size like 10, Arial 10, or Courier New 10, depending on how your eyes are, and then never writing more than 4 sentences in that format, and you will see that all of your writing is much clearer. It sounds ridiculous, but it actually works. I still use it to this day. I still write everything in that format, and I just noticed that it regulates the length of sentences, the length of paragraphs, and it helps you look at things on the page much clearer.
And do you read your copy out loud?
I do, yeah. I would say, being honest, probably 70% of the time. Sometimes I don't. If I'm in the cafe, that it's usually quite hard to do. But at home, I will read it out aloud, and I've found over time that it's a quicker way to edit stuff.
Yeah, I imagine you can weed out jargon quite successfully doing that.
Yeah, just you stutter on certain things. You say something and it just sounds like so stupid, and you just think, what? No one would ever say that. And I'd like to think I get kudos here and there from different people who have no agenda to be nice to me, who say that when they read my stuff, it's kind of quite friendly and open and authentic. And I think that might be one of the main reasons behind why that effect is there, because I do try and make sure it flows. It's easy to read if you were to read it out aloud.
Yeah, I think when done badly, copy can have so much friction when you read it, and it makes it hard to read. So being friendly and open is often the best way to be. There's a great tip from Bob Levinson, who was behind a lot of the great VW ads. And one of his tips was when he was writing, he would always pretend he was writing a letter to a friend, and he'd start off, "Dear Charlie," and then he'd write some copy of what he needed to tell Charlie. And he said at the end, just cross out "Dear Charlie," and you're probably going to be close enough.
Oh yeah, definitely. I can't. Half this stuff is just stuff that I've learned from other people. Like none of this stuff is like particularly original from me. I'm sure some of it is. I'm probably too humble in a typically English way. But Bill Bonner, literally, like from the moment he first kind of taught us how to write copy, had this idea of you speak to people like the bar stool test. Like, would you sit at a bar and explain it to your friend? That salutation, there's a bit in my book where I advise everybody to, whatever piece of copy you're writing, even if it's just a Facebook advert, start with "Dear Reader," or if you can pick someone you know, dear mum or what have you. Delete it afterwards, but just never forget that you are one person talking to another person. Yes, it's a mass media, but only one person reads it at a time to get that connection. So it's a great piece of advice to always kind of write "Dear Charlie" at the top and sign it off as well. Sign it off by yourself. Say "Best wishes, Glenn" at the end, because it reminds you that you're not some kind of ghost writer like hidden behind the screens. You're a person talking to another person, and you have a responsibility, I think, when you're writing copy, that it needs to be human. It needs to come from someone, and you need to stand behind what you're saying. So I would always try and start with a "Dear Reader," but also sign it off "Best wishes" as well.
Yeah. Well, your point there on originality, I mean, to be honest, the longer I work in this industry, the more I realise that it's largely irrelevant. I mean, I feel like a huge fraud whenever I share any advice, because it typically, you can probably trace it back to the likes of Dave Trott, Mark Ritson, Rory Sutherland, Richard Shotton. I mean, latterly, they can probably trace it back even further. So really,
oh, definitely.
I think the real value is in sharing anything you can share that's valuable to anyone. And
definitely. I there's 2 points on that. Like number one, I always remember I love a band called Don Caballero. It's like this esoteric Chicago math rock band, and I thought they were like, when we were growing up, we were like, oh my god, we have discovered like the newest music in the world. It was kind of off kilter timings and stuff and what have you. And we were like, this is amazing. No one's ever done this before. And then I think we played it to someone, and they went, "Oh, they've been listening to King Crimson, haven't they?" And I was like, "What? Who's King Crimson?" So I went back and listened to King Crimson and was like, "Oh, right, that's all King Crimson. It's the same. Like, that's what they've been doing." And then you realise that they were just going back to something until you get to Mozart or something along those lines. So it always happens. It always happens. And there's nothing wrong with that. And then I suddenly realised, like, why do they keep making, like, Brideshead Revisited films or, like, Pride and Prejudice? Why do they keep doing it over and over again? Like, wasn't the original good enough? And it's to get to new generations, and people react to things differently, and on that reason, there's a lot of copywriters out there sharing advice and everything, and a lot of them feel like imposter syndrome and all this kind of thing. But the fact of the matter is, the way you talk and the way you message something and the way you talk about that particular thing, even if it's not an original thing, even if you've been influenced by someone else, the way you talk about it, someone might react to it slightly differently, and it might get them that time. Someone might not listen to Roy Sutherland and think, "Ah, you know what, he's talking nonsense." But then they hear you say it and they go, "Yeah, do you know what? I never thought about that before."
yeah, I think it's the other way around, to be fair, Glenn, but okay.
Yeah, well, maybe. But at the same time, I think so long as everybody, if you know where you got it from, cite it. Tell people to go back and dig into the history of advertising, because there is so much good stuff there. You go back, as you mentioned, a generation there of fantastic thinkers, but go back to Claude Hopkins and all those people, and go back to all that. There's so much out there. But you can always tell your story. And I'd advise anybody listening to this, like, never feel like an imposter in that respect, because someone out there will relate to your telling of it in a slightly different way, and that's got a lot of value to it.
Yeah, and as per your great example there with the band, in some instances it will be the first time anyone's heard it. So, just let them enjoy that.
Exactly.
I won't try and pronounce this because I'll trip myself over and sound like an idiot. So I'm going to abbreviate it to FK score.
Yep.
Can you explain what the FK score is and why it's such a useful tool to use in copywriting?
Sure. It's a bit of a controversial one. This I always find whenever I try and write something about it, everybody's like, "Oh no, you don't know, it doesn't work. It's too technical, to this thing, to this or that, or whatever." It's for me, and I say it as a disclaimer, it's just a nice tool you can use to check yourself. If you're looking for a bit of kind of guidance or just to a double check, the FK score refers to. I'm not so good on the pronunciation, but I think it's Flesh Kincaid. Two people. It was Rudolph Fleisch, and I think it was Stephen Kincaid. I'm not quite sure, but they were basically, I want to say scientists, but I'm not sure if that's the right word. But they were basically doing studies into readability, and they were doing it largely. It was for the U.S. Army, and they were trying to kind of do it for manuals and stuff. So that obviously in the U.S. Army, you need to very clearly communicate things quickly, efficiently, and without any kind of interpretation or possible weird interpretations. So that's where all this came from. And they came up with these readability scores and readability tests. And it was based on like the US grading systems at school. And they were looking at basic like syllables in words and all this, and how many words were in a sentence, dividing it all up and all that kind of stuff. You can spend ages like arguing whether it was how valuable that is or what have you. It's completely up to you. But for me, and what I was taught it by Mark Ford, who works with Agora, and he used to, he was very strict with it, and he'd say, if your FK score is above 8, I'm not reading it. You have, I know that you don't know what you're talking about, and you have not communicated your idea correctly. And he's a very direct bloke and fantastic in that sense. But he was just like, no, I'm not reading it if it's above 8. The reason he did that is because basically this FK score, you get this the FK reading ease or something, which is a score like a double-digit score, and you're looking to be around 50 to 80 kind of thing. And then you have the FK score, which is the grade score. It's like the equivalent grade or something that you'd have in America, in the American school system. But basically anything above 8, it starts to get a bit complicated. But what they did in Agora was that someone took all of the editorial pieces, all of the writing from like really like good writers and really interesting people who had been writing for years, who have massive like stats on open rates and all this kind of stuff. And it just so happened that the writers with the most engagement, the people who were most successful in the way they communicated with their readers, happened to have the lowest FK scores. So Mark took that on board, started doing this as a basic test, and now I will do that with every piece of writing I'll look at. I'll just run it. You can run it in Word. It's just at the grammar check-ins. You can turn it on, and it will say FK reading ease and FK score. And if your writing is above 8, you probably means that you are not clearly writing about. You're not posing your idea in a very clear way. You will find a way to, if you can cut it down below 8, it means it will force you to think more clearly about how you want to communicate your idea. So that's how I use it. There's a load of people out there, like last time I posted an article, people were like, oh no, you could get a different score here. All you have to do is do like little words and then it changes. You can do all that if you want, fine. That's cheating the system. But if you just take it in a very face value way, if you see that your writing is higher than an 8, it probably could do with some editing. And I use it invariably if a company comes to me and they're going, our copy's a bit like crap and it's not working. It's a bit wordy and all this kind of stuff. If you run the FK score, you'll see straight away it's like 12 to 20, and it's like, right, there's your first problem. Let's get that down, and then you can very quickly break it down and show the client very effectively, this is why your copy's there, because the readability scores are out. If you cut them down below 8, like half of my writing is like 5 or something like that. If you get it down to that, it's a very quick way to kind of evidence how much clearer you can be, and your use of English, shorter words, shorter sentences, simpler words with less syllables. It just plays into a much clearer piece of writing.
And would you advise people use that tool across the board? So regardless of the type of copy they're writing.
Yeah, I use it for everything. Just have a run. Don't shoot yourself if it's above 12 every time. That's fine, kind of thing. You can make excuses for that or what have you, and there will be exceptions all the time. But if you just run a piece of copy and have a check of it, chances are, if you're honest with yourself, you could probably, if it's higher than 8, as a general rule of thumb, chances are you could probably be clearer in your copy.
Fantastic. I was going to ask you another question, actually, but I've noticed that it's similar to one of the listener questions I've got for you. So we might jump straight there if
No
that
problem.
works with you.
Yeah.
So asking the general public for their opinion, be it on Brexit or boat names, is notoriously fraught with danger, but that's not stopped us. So we've had a couple in. So starting with Mark, who is a copywriter. He says, you've said in the past that anyone can be a copywriter.
Mm-hmm.
You clearly haven't seen my mum's spelling, so that is bullshit, surely.
Poor Mark's mum. My heart goes out to
I know. I do hope Mark's mum's listening.
a budding copywriter in the making, and her dreams have been quashed by her own son. Can anybody be a copywriter? I believe anybody can write copy. That is simply a true fact. Can anybody? The question we're really asking is, can anyone write effective copy? I believe, given a couple of hours with Mark's mum, this already sounds weird what I'm saying, but
question 2.
Given a couple of hours, I could improve her copywriting. The way I look at it is that really good copywriters generally have some kind of innate talent to write. That's not necessarily they've been writing from birth. I've just last episode of my podcast, I was speaking to Gareth Hancock, who's a great copywriter. He's got a really good tone of voice, really good turn of phrase, and he was a bricklayer, and he completely kind of stumbled into copywriting by chance. So obviously there was something there in him that could do that. So that's an advantage. If you, however, rather than using Mark's mum as an example, I would probably use a more practical thing of a business owner or a small business person who's trying to improve their copy, but they can't write copy. They know about their product and everything. But they might not be the best writer. There are technical ways, and I've tried to share as many of these as I can in the book. There are technical things you can do to improve your copywriting. You're probably never going to sit there and produce a 10,000 word sales letter that's going to be effective, but you can certainly use the technical skills that you learn. I'm talking about things like FK score, understanding that if you use shorter sentences, smaller paragraphs, simpler words, if you turn features into benefits, if you instead of saying me and I all the time and we, you say you focus on the reader. If you do all of these things, you can improve your copywriting by percentage X. Will you become a fantastic copywriter and do that innately? If you practice long enough, I think you could probably get kind of good. And I think Mark's mum could probably practice and do that. So I do think anyone could write better copy. Is probably a on the fence way of doing that. As I get older, I think it does help the more innate you are at thinking and expressing ideas. Of course, that's it's all really about ideas, to be honest with you. But I just think I always say that more to suggest that there's no need for bad copy. If people take the time and think about things logically and apply the numerous ideas and kind of tips that are out there, not just in my book, in everybody's books and just free on the internet, you can write better copy. Anyone can write better copy than they're currently doing. I don't know if that answers Mark's question, but hopefully it does in a way.
I think it does. I certainly think it should. The story you mentioned earlier about the snooker business is exactly that. It was a good example of how someone using the art of the click managed to make their sales copy more effective, all for the price of £14.99. So
£9.62 at the moment.
Is it really?
Yeah. I think I'm assuming that means it's selling well on Amazon. because they keep putting it down so they can make more of a loss. But yeah, so it's £9.62. What a brilliant,
Wow,
brilliant number.
less than a tenner.
Yeah, less than a tenner. I just had a review today actually saying that it was worth more than a £500 course on copywriting or whatever, but one of those things. But yeah, no, I do think you don't need to buy my book. There's stuff all over the internet. It's if you want to write good, better copy, and you should, there is no reason anyone shouldn't. You should take the time, find a few tricks, and just like get your little secret 5 things that you check every time and improve it a little bit, because the results, the effect on the business, or ultimately anybody trying to get a client in any field will be there.
And just to clarify, you should buy the book.
Well, yes.
Question 2, so it's quite a selfish one here. I've stuck one of my questions in because I'm a bit of a word nerd,
No problem.
certainly in terms of letter forms and typography. So as I am a typography geek, I'm keen to know if you have a favourite letter.
Favorite letter? That's an interesting one. My favorite letter, I always encourage my guests in that to think straight off the top of the head and say the first thing rather than trying to be cool. My first thought was to say G, which is just not correct, just because it's obviously Giles and Glenn, so we've both got the G. I like the G. Do you know what I do like? I like the lowercase G's in what you'll typography expert with the full loop at the bottom.
Descender.
Yeah, is that like a Times New Roman, or no? It's probably a Georgia or a Garamond kind of thing. Have them in, but I do like those G's. I like X is always useful. I use a lot of X's to fill in spaces when I'm writing copy and don't quite know what to say. But yeah, T is a good thing. I'm thinking of cheesy marketing reasons now. I think it was Steven Pinker or someone like that who said that all marketers are like T-shape, and that you have to understand sales, and then your T, the line down, is your specific skill, so marketer or copywriter or whatever. But that's just too cliche, so let's move on. I'll go with G. Yeah, I'll go with G. I spend enough time with G, so.
Okay, it was nice symmetry there with the X and the T as well. I wondered if that was your reason.
Maybe.
And you love pst.
I love it. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm sneaking in another question here. So what's that all about?
What's that all about? Well, I think I can't remember where I saw it. I think I might have to give this to Bill Bonner, because he wrote for years. The man just writes every day and still does. But once I think I saw like a PS that just said psst at the end, and I thought it was such a visually brilliant thing, and it made you lean in. It was like, wow, like that's a visceral reaction I've had to a printed word, like to lean in like that. And I adopted that over the years, I think, I can only assume, and kind of would do it for PSs here and there and what have you. And then I think I was bold enough to do it in a subject line once, and the subject line worked really well. And then a good friend of mine, a guy called Ben, who I used to work with, he clocked that I kept using this psst kind of thing. He respected the audacity of it and the silliness of it, but the effectiveness of it. And so that it became a private joke between us. And then when it came to writing the book, I just thought I had to leave it in there, and it just so worked for that kind of postscript in copy is always useful. So I still love it, and I've started seeing it around. If I was a megalomaniac, I'd start thinking people were stealing stuff from me, but I just think it's a brilliant. It's just a visceral thing.
I think maybe you're noticing it though. I think it's one of those things, isn't it?
Of course, yeah. Yeah.
So with my notes that I've got in front, this is terrible podcast material, by the way, terrible audio. But I've got the word psst printed out in front of me, and it's occurred to me A, that it's such a lovely word to look at, but B, I don't know when I last saw that in print. I don't think I've ever seen it in print, perhaps.
Yeah, no, I'm very big on. I think people probably think I'm mad, especially non-copywriting, when I go to businesses, or there's a section in the book, I think, where I talk about trying to get the reader to nod yes, so they're agreeing with you, and to try and elicit like physical responses to your language. We all know the phrase "lol" when we laugh out loud and something, and we've all experienced that moment when you do laugh out on the train, and you have a physical reaction to the image that's been created by the writer. I always remember there's a bit in Douglas Adams' Hitchhiker's Guide where he describes three. I think there's like a ship escaping or something, and there's three scientists who are kind of stood there with white clipboards, white coats and clipboards, and he describes. I think it's like the Hulavu or something. It's this alien, but it's just blue. It's just the concept and color blue or something, and just the way he described it. It was one of the first times I laughed physically to the written word and was like, wow, that's interesting. I've physically reacted to that. So I've always been very much. You'll see in my writing a lot of you get that right, and there's a question mark. So it's people just trying to push people to start going, yeah, I do, and nod along, because if you're in that positive mindset, if you're thinking yes, 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 when you come to say at the end, would you like to give me the money and buy this thing now? You're more physically into it, and you're doing that. The psst is another way of doing that. It draws you in when you say psst, no matter how silly you there's a suspension of disbelief going on with any piece of writing where you're being talked to on the page, like it's not that person talking to you, but you suspend your disbelief and you read it as though it is, or at least the most effective copy makes you do that, and it brings you it draws you in closer to the screen. And that's when you can start making a real engagement with someone. So I think it's a silly thing, it's a fun thing, but I actually think behind it there's a very useful, interesting line of thought to pursue.
So now I'm dying to know what you think of LOL.
Do you know what? I'll be honest. I for years thought it meant love you lots or something. I thought it meant
Lots of love. So did the mum of a friend of mine who texted her to say, your uncle has died, lol.
Well, mine luckily wasn't as bad as that, but I realised my cousin kept saying lots of or something, and I thought, why is she being so friendly? Like, that's weird. And then it took me ages. Like, I'm an idiot really when it comes down to it. But yeah, so I don't particularly like these things, or I probably made out like I didn't used to. And as I get older, I realize that you do have to keep remaking Pride and Prejudice because people change. And if you sit around denying the existence of text speak and emojis and all this kind of stuff, you are very quickly going to become forgotten yourself. And in the world of advertising, in a world where, as a copywriter particularly, but any creative in the advertising arena, if you aren't able to talk in people's language, then you're going to be in trouble. So I would rather not use LOL myself, but I accept its existence as I do emojis.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think if you, unless you accept that, you do tend to age quicker. So we come to the final part of the interview now, Glenn, with our 4 pertinent posers that we like to put to all of our guests. So question 1 is, what advice would you give to your younger self?
I would say to stop rushing. I was always very fast and very eager to get everything done there at that minute, and probably wasn't as strategic in my thinking as I often could be. So I'd definitely say slow down and be more strategic in things. And overall, in a kind of, oh, look at me, aren't I wise? I would probably say to realize that money isn't as important as time. Time is the real important thing in life, and that's not just from a personal point of view. That is from understanding what makes people tick and connecting with people when it comes to writing copy. Your time is the most valuable asset people have, and you should speak to that as often as you can.
Absolutely. Number 2 then, if you could banish one thing from the industry, what would it be and why?
I thought about this, and I realized I try to be really positive in everything I do in this world, in this industry, my presence online and all that kind of stuff. And I don't like to slag copy off and all this kind of stuff. And then when you posed this question to me originally, I was like, God, I thought of so many things and realized I had such a deep anger for so many things. But I will go with, I don't like, there's in the industry, advertising industry, I think there's a lot of insecurity And that kind of shows itself in like a jealousy and a bitchiness that sometimes comes about. And I don't think it's helpful necessarily. I think we could turn some of the bad mouthing and mockery of things into a more positive thing about how what is good advertising, what is how you should speak to people, how you should communicate, how you can improve messaging and all that kind of stuff. Share in a more positive way.
Yeah, I think that's good advice for me personally too. I'm very, very grumpy and moody and quick to point out things which aren't good.
Yeah, I mean, don't get me wrong. It's partly through, as I say, when you get in the public eye, people can say anything, and you just think, well, I didn't mean that. Like, what are you talking about? And then you realize actually that frivolous comment of someone else, like someone's probably behind that. Like there might be a copywriter behind like the worst piece of copy who's desperately trying to make some money to like pay for their housing bills or whatever kind of thing, and they've been forced by the client to do X, Y, and Z. And I suddenly thought, yeah, actually, like treat your neighbour as you wish to be treated, kind of thing. So.
Yeah, we've all got bills to pay, so I'm sure we've all done work that we don't want to pin up and have everyone judge it. So, yeah, wise words. Are there any books that you would recommend? I mean, you've named a few heroes and mentors already, so the likes of David Ogilvy, Bill Bonner, and Mark Ford, etc. But are there any particular books that you think people should buy?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big reader. I'm obsessed with books to the point where it'll probably bankrupt me one day. But I'm a big fan of reading widely. I don't think you should just read books on copy and everything. There's some fantastic ones, and read them all. But I would, whenever asked this question, I always encourage people to think about books outside of the industry. I love Paul Auster. Anything by him has had a big effect on my writing. Milan Kundera has been fantastic. I would encourage people to, if you're a copywriter particularly, or if you want to understand how people think, I personally think reading a lot of philosophy is helpful. I think a book called Sophie's World, most people have probably heard of that. I think it's Justine Gardner, which kind of summarizes a lot of philosophy, is really good. Just makes you think about how people think. If you want to go hardcore, there's Bertrand Russell, History of Western Philosophy, is very useful. Aside from that, you read your Dave Trotts, read a book called Great Leads by Mark Ford and John Ford, two Agora guys. That's really good. That may be probably a few people in the industry haven't come across. That's a really good read. But yeah, just read as much and as often as you can. Don't try and consume it dead fast. Take your time. It's not about how much you read. It's just about reading and getting new ideas and being inspired.
Good advice. And we always dedicate the show to someone, and we bestow or hospital pass, depending on your point of view, to our guest, who also has to give their reason why. So over to you, Glenn.
So I thought about this, and I've dedicated my book to my partner Ruth, who's been a massive support. So I'm not going to do that. And then I was thinking of copywriters who don't get as much credit and press or what have you. And then I thought, well, how the hell do I pick between like the massive network of people I've discovered on Twitter in the past few years? So I think a good way of doing that is to dedicate it to the hashtag Content Club UK, which is every Tuesday, a load of copywriters, UK copywriters, get together and share questions and answers. And I think that's really useful. So I would kind of dedicate it to them. If I'm going to have to pick one, I will pick Gareth Hancock, who's the most recent guest on my podcast, simply because he wrote me such a fantastic advance comment for the book. So I will, roundabout way of sitting on the fence, Content Club UK, but also big up to Gareth.
Brilliant. So as a final call to action, please everyone buy Glenn's book. It is fantastic. And you don't have to take my word for that when you've got Vikki, Ross, Richard Shotton, Drayton Bird, and dozens others. Glenn also has a fantastic podcast, All Good Copy, which I would also highly recommend. We'll share links to everything we've discussed, all of the books, the Content Club UK hashtag on the podcast homepage, but how else can people get more Glenn Fisher?
They can visit allgoodcopy.com, which is where I do like a weekly thing, either posting the podcast or I'll write a little article about giving like one tip away. So that's always there. You can follow me generally what I'm doing, although it's a bit kind of self-indulgent on theglennfisher.com. That's my kind of what I'm up to. But that does detail anything like speaking. I've got like a few talks coming up. I'm down in London in October. Before that, I'm in Leeds in June. And I'll be doing a few more of those. So that's a good way to find that. You can find me on Twitter at allgoodcopy. Or you can find pictures of me and my dog on Instagram if that floats your boat. But you can generally find me in places. I'm nearly the most famous Glenn Fisher on the internet, although there is a Canadian hockey player I think who's still slightly outdoing me on Google. But
oh, you should do what Stephen Colgan did and just change the spelling of your name so that it is unique.
Oh, don't get me started on that. I've got two N's, and it's like as soon as I can see people with spelling with one N, it's like a death rays through the computer. So I need to stick to two N's. But yeah, no, people can find me anyway. Yeah.
Amazing. Well, thank you for joining us, Glenn. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you.
No problem. Thank you for having me.
And thank you to everyone who's willingly let their ears be bent by us for the last hour. Please continue to share and get in touch with the show with anything from guest requests to questions you want us to field in upcoming episodes. Simply find us on Twitter or email us at hello@calltoaction.co.
I can't get no call to action. I can't get no call to action, but I try and I try